Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now nearing the end of our third season, and we are perhaps more excited than ever to continue to help you explore and understand that unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here are issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung, heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we continue our September series on environmental justice and the burdens that our children take for us. And today we're going to focus in on the economics of environmental justice and its impacts on everybody's pocketbook. Now, locating polluting facilities in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color means that people with marginalized identities experience more asthma, a greater likelihood of heart attacks, and even premature death. The disadvantages that come with those health issues, like missing school, create a cycle of poverty and lack of access to opportunity that can span generations and shapes every part of the experience of being a person of color or a person of low income in these United States. And as our society, though, becomes more and more interconnected every day, the impacts of this situation increasingly are spreading to everyone in unintended and unthought of ways, as the COVID pandemic has and is continuing to clearly show us. The grassroots movement that placed environmental justice issues on the national stage around 1980 was soon followed up by research documenting the correlation between pollution and race and poverty. In 1978, some 31,000 gallons of PCB, which is a highly, highly dangerous chemical, were illegally dumped on behalf of the Ward Transformer Company across 14 counties in North Carolina. The state then collected the contaminated soil, and then they identified 2 landfill sites for the waste disposal. One was a publicly owned landfill in Chatham County in North Carolina, and another was a recently foreclosed property in Warren County, North Carolina. Now, the Warren County site had a shallow water table, which basically made it unsuitable for a landfill. However, that site was privately owned, and it was near a town that had no mayor or city council. In contrast, the Chatham County site was publicly owned, giving local residents an opportunity to participate in making that decision as to whether or not those toxic PCBs could be dumped there. Additionally, in 1980, Warren County was 60% black and 25% of its families were below the poverty line, whereas the corresponding figures for Chatham County were only 27% black and 6% below the poverty line. So, guess what? Ultimately, the state placed the landfill in Warren County. And of course, protests began to erupt over this decision, and it drew widespread support from civil rights groups, and it gained national media attention. Thus, the environmental justice movement was born. Now, since then, a growing body of academic work in law, sociology, public policy, geosciences, and economics has further investigated such correlations under a variety of measures. In 1993, some 10 years after it was cited, the Warren County landfill in North Carolina was found to be leaking PCBs. Eventually, 81,500 tons of contaminated soil were excavated and burned at a cost of $18 million, seemingly justifying the initial protest over the decision. Moreover, As more recent case of lead contamination in the water of Flint, Michigan indicates, controversies over environmental justice are still with us and seem to be growing and spawning grandchildren every day. Like Warren County, Flint is disproportionately poor and African American. And also like Warren County, Flint was higher level or had higher levels of government that made decisions that affected the local populations, whereas the local populations felt that they did not have an adequate voice. Now, from the perspective of economists, the economic motivation for examining environmental justice lies in determining the extent to which environmental discrimination results in inefficiency. Now, this is not meant to suggest that the issue of fairness or equity is irrelevant. Rather, it means that economics is concerned with markets and efficiencies. And economic efficiency is a significant tool that policymakers and the business community, as well as you and I, use to enhance or inform our decision-making process and to activate our changes or changes in our behavior. And so, by examining the possible sources of market inefficiencies caused by environmental justice, i.e. economics, then a framework and greater motivation for correcting that market failure can be established. And so, as you see or can imagine, the problem with environmental injustice is multifaceted. Then there's climate justice, which requires sharing the burdens and benefits of climate change and its resolution equitably and fairly. It brings together justice between generations and justice within generations. And of course, climate change builds upon, or should I say, it heaps even more burden upon those impacted by environmental justice. However, there's some light. Recently, the White House Council on Environmental Quality released a version of a climate and economic justice screening tool. And this was a major step toward addressing current and historic environmental injustices and fulfilling a key campaign promise from President Biden. This tool is a critical component of the president's historic environmental justice commitments in the executive order 14008, including the Justice 40 initiative that hopefully we'll talk about a little bit more today. And that was a commitment, the Justice 40 initiative. It's a commitment to deliver 40% of overall benefits of federal climate, clean energy, affordable and sustainable housing, clean water, and other investments to those disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, that are underserved, and that are overburdened by pollution. And this tool will help agencies identify disadvantaged communities to ensure that everyone indeed is receiving the benefits intended from the federal programs. As the commissioner of this advisory board said, too many American communities are still living with water that isn't safe to drink, living with housing that isn't built to withstand climate change fuel storms, and too few opportunities to benefit from the nation's bright and clean future. The Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool will help federal agencies ensure that the benefits of the nation's climate, clean energy, and environmental programs are finally reaching these communities that have been left out and left behind for far too long. Now, this is a lot, but here today to help us unpack some of this are two experts, and we are hoping that they're going to make us all smarter about this. Today we have with us Ben Nathan with eSource and Alessandro Rigolon with University of Utah. Now, Ben is a lead analyst at eSource, where he researches and advises power utilities and cities on energy equity strategies. Ben has also worked at the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the National Renewable Energy Lab, where he helps states, local governments, and public utilities with energy and environmental planning and management. Now, did I get all of that right, Ben?
You sure did.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Really appreciate you being able to join us today. And Alessandro is an assistant professor in the Department of City and Metropolitan Planning at the University of Utah. His research primarily focuses on environmental justice issues related to urban green space and their impacts on health equity. His current work includes three main areas: policy determinants of inequities in park provision, drivers and resistance to gentrification, fostered by new green space, i.e. green gentrification, and the public health impacts of urban green space on marginalized communities. Welcome, Alessandro. And did I get all of that right?
Yes, excellent.
Thank you, and I really appreciate you all joining us today. Now, we only have a minute to go before we go to break, so I'm going to start with you, Alessandro, knowing that it will be, you can give us a brief response, and then we'll continue on the other side of the break to dig into it. So I want to ask you, Alessandro, first, what do you see as the top three major sources of our environmental justice, or I like to say environmental injustice issues in the U.S. today?
Yeah, I would say that air quality is definitely one in terms of unequal exposure to particulate matter, ozone, and other forms of air pollution. I would add water, potentially number two, as the continued situation in Flint, Michigan shows, as well as the most recent issues that we've seen in Mississippi. And then saying this for my own research, but inequitable access to green space is potentially a third one.
Sounds good. And those are interesting, and I want to really unpack those so people understand how and why, and they would connect the dots for us. So we will unpack this a lot more with our experts on the other side of the break. We'll be back with Alessandro Rigolon and with Ben Nathan. Thank you all. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. Our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, none mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. And our other sponsor is the Weston A. Price Foundation, based on research of nutrition pioneer Dr. Weston Price, whose studies establish that the parameters of human health and determine the optimum characteristics of human diets. The Weston A. Price Foundation is a member-supported organization dedicated to restoring nutrient-dense foods to the modern diet, especially animal fats, through education, scientific research, and activism. It connects local farms with health-conscious consumers. The Weston A. Price Foundation is having their annual conference for 2022 called Wise Traditions, where nearly 1,100 attendees gather for learning, demonstration, exhibits, impressive speakers, and delicious, nutritious meals that embody the principles of the Weston A. Price Foundation. It's coming up in Knoxville, Tennessee on October 21st through 22nd. For more information, visit wisetraditions.org. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today, to our show today on the economics of environmental justice and impacts on everyone's pocketbook. And we are back with Ben Nathan with eSource and Alessandro Rigolon with the University of Utah. And before the break, Alessandro had told us that he sees the top three major sources of environmental justice or injustice today in the U.S. as air pollution, water issues, and inequitable access to nature sources or green sources. So, Alessandro, I want to continue with that. Connect the dots for us in terms of those sources and how and why they create environmental injustices.
So, the primary reason why those three sources are considered environmental injustices is because unhealthy air quality brings issues related to respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases, etc. In a similar way, not having access to clean water leads to a series of health issues. And on the other hand, not having access to green space limits physical activity, limits the extent to which we get natural cooling during our increasingly hot summers, and also limits the extent to which we are encouraged to use alternative means of transportation like walking, biking, and therefore, in a loop way, encourages us to drive more, which makes our air worse.
Indeed. And I want to connect these back with economics, because that's what we want to focus on today, the pocketbook part of all of this. So what are the stats? Are there any statistics, or you can just give us a description of the economic impacts? What's it costing? Not only the folks upon whom the environmental injustices are heaped, but what's it costing all of us?
So, there are two main mechanisms through which environmental injustices lead to economic burden. One is increased healthcare costs. A place that experiences worse air, worse water, and has less access to green space will be a place where, on average, people spend more for their healthcare. And the second mechanism is through lower educational achievement. Places that have poor air quality, places with less green space, over time lead to lower educational achievement through kids missing school, or attention disorders, and other, another mechanisms. So over time, as you know, people with lower educational achievement will have a lower, level of earnings in terms of their jobs. So again, health is one mechanism, and education is another one.
And I want to expand that a little bit, too, because as we talk about low income and minorities, I've often heard, and you, I'm sure, have some information and stats to add to this, that those group of people are also overrepresented or very, very, very highly represented in our public support systems, say the public hospitals and social programs.
Yes, and therefore, if we continue to disproportionately burden them through air pollution and polluted water and lower access to green space, we as a society are spending more to then, cure them or take care of them through public healthcare dollars, as well as spend more to try to integrate them in jobs later on, instead of going upstream and providing a better environment and a better education so that people can sort of take care more of themselves.
I wonder, I know that there's been lots of research done on the situation in Flint, and I imagine it's ramping up right now in Mississippi. But for Flint, there seems to be a lot of good data. So I have to wonder, is there any information about the number of documented health issues caused by the Flint water situation as to health burden of the public hospitals and public facilities there? Because that can really equate right on down to the taxpayers' pocketbooks, locally, at the state level, and even nationally.
Unfortunately, I don't have direct expertise in water issues. I can say, however, that from the air quality point of view, there are numerous studies that show that, for example, on average, air pollution from fossil fuels costs each American about $2,500 a year in extra medical bills. And then, of course, there is a quasi-linear relationship between more air pollution and increased healthcare spending, especially in ER visits, which are really expensive.
So you're saying that there's research out there that's saying that air quality or air pollution is causing each of us $2,500 more a year in healthcare cost.
Yes.
That's a lot. And I imagine at some point there's, like I said, maybe they're churning away and in their computers now trying to figure out cost for a lot of the specific environmental justices of which we've become aware. Because I know it takes time for that research to happen and that to be collected. Ben, are you aware of any stats as it relates to Flint? Or any other of the significant environmental justice issues around there. Because what I'm finding out, I found out from last week's show, is just about every place has some kind of environmental justice nightmare. If it's not a nightmare, it's an issue or a finding, something that was totally unintended that has now come to light. So are you aware of any stats out there that are showing on some of these issues a direct correlation in terms of additional cost, usually healthcare, but not necessarily exclusively, that were borne by the taxpayers?
Yeah, I've seen some pretty big and scary numbers that I think if you did the math, you'd probably see how we got from Alessandro's $2,500 per person per year to some of these figures I've seen. I've seen one study that estimates that the total economic value of health impacts from the fossil fuel industry, so from air pollution, and this is a much more global or nationwide scale than just pollution issues in Flint, that total economic value is $360 to $880 billion annually, which would represent 2.5 to 6% of the U.S. national GDP. So that is a significant portion of our economy. And I've seen another figure out of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health that has linked fossil fuel burning to, and this is a pretty huge number, to 20% of global deaths in 2018. So I think that should be a message to everyone that pollution has a massive human and wallet impact on us, both nationally and internationally, and that this is a real problem that doesn't respect borders. It is certainly more predominant and more impactful in certain communities that have historically had polluting facilities located in them, but these are nationwide numbers. This affects everyone.
Indeed, as some of our guests made the point last week, low-income and minority or the vulnerable populations, they get the bulk of the air pollution. They get the bulk of many of the water issues. But as you said, it doesn't stop at borders. And increasingly, as our society, as our world becomes more interconnected, then all of us are getting it. They just get more of it. And, of course, they are already less able to withstand it, less able to pay for it, but somebody has to pay for it, and it's the rest of us. And that's kind of the point we want to make sure that everybody understands. As I mentioned earlier when I was kind of going through my description of economics, how economics is more so concerned with inefficiencies. But these measurements are something that can activate people to change the behavior. Last thing before we go to break really quickly, and you covered a lot of it, Ben, because I was going to ask you in terms of what do you see as top environmental justice issues, not just in the U.S., but around the world today, because that may be different.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the top issue, but it's certainly the issue that I am immersed in every day is energy system inequities and injustices. I think there's two sides of this. One is that really for decades now, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, frontline and other low-income communities have really borne the brunt of the negative impacts of our energy system. That could look like suffering disproportionately from power outages, paying more in energy prices, as well as the pollution from energy generation facilities. So we've seen those communities both bear the negative impacts of our energy system, but also they've received a far disproportionate amount of the benefits that we're seeing now from energy efficiency and our transition to clean energy.
I want to explore that a lot more on the other side. We're going to go to break now, and we'll be right back to finish that conversation, Ben, because you've kind of intrigued me here. Thank you. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on the economics of environmental justice and impacts on everyone's pocketbook. And we are back with Dr. Alessandro Rigolon with the University of Utah and with Ben Nathan with eSource. Again, thank you all for being with us today. And before the break, Ben was intriguing us with how some of the vulnerable communities are disproportionately benefiting from some of the improvements or some of the things that are being done to impact energy inequities. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, these communities are certainly facing disproportionate negative energy system impacts and conditions. So one example is when we look nationally at how much households spend on their energy or how much customers report energy insecurity, which means that they are at risk of having their power shut off due to a lack of payment for their utility bills. Non-white households, in some studies, are twice as likely to have energy insecurity and risk having utilities shut off their power. These communities are also often paying a lot more for their energy.
Why is that?
Well, a lot of that is because these communities often have a lot of housing that is inefficient and is not what we call in the industry weatherized. These houses lose a lot of the energy that they take in, and through heating and cooling, a lot of that energy is wasted and released because these homes are in poor condition. So this has caused the industry, the utility industry, as well as state and local and federal governments, to really focus on weatherization programs for these homes to make them more energy efficient, and which saves costs for the customers, energy costs for the customers, and also saves energy on a much larger scale for our society.
Ben, also, too, is there an emerging environmental justice or environmental injustice issue that we should be thinking about now, or that folks have only just begun to talk about?
Yeah, I think maybe the biggest one, it's a hot topic, is electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are increasingly taking up a larger and larger part of the car market. People estimate that in the next couple decades, they may represent most cars on the road. The concern now is that there's very low uptake in these expensive electric vehicles in a lot of low-income and historically disadvantaged communities, and we simply can't afford to leave these communities behind in our transition to electric vehicles. So this is something that a lot of power utilities are focused on, that the government is focused on, and the negative impacts of our traditional transportation system really are going to continue to be felt more strongly in disadvantaged communities, which are often next to highways and heavy industrial zones where a lot of pollution and noise comes from traditional cars. And if we don't focus our electric vehicle efforts in these communities, we're really all going to risk losing a lot here in the transition to electric vehicles.
But from everything I am seeing and hearing, the cost of electric vehicles is really dropping almost to be on parity with non-electric vehicles. I think that Ford F-150 starts at about $37,000 to $40,000, which is where a lot of cars start. Then you've got the the Nissan Leaf that's fairly inexpensive. But that causes me to think of something that I read about doing while researching this topic, and it was the fact that environmental justice or environmental injustice, another source of problems is misinformation or no information. And I'd like both of you all to address that. Alessandro, let's start with you. What do you know about, or what are you seeing in terms of the research and the impact of misinformation on environmental injustice?
It's a great question. I think one thing that I can think about is how oftentimes politicians portray green space as something that is nice to have, and not something that is essential because they want to slash public budgets on parks and recreation and tree canopy. While on the other hand, the green spaces are essential infrastructure, especially in marginalized communities, especially in places where people might have, unweatherized homes and maybe no air conditioning, and going to a park or to a public rec center is probably the only place where, one can be in a very hot day. We know that the fossil fuel industry has spread a lot of misinformation around the negative impacts of, driving on local air quality and climate change. When those ideas are spread that, that driving a gas car is okay and that you should do that because that's American way of life, you mostly disproportionately impact those racial and ethnic minority folks and those low-income folks living near highways and near places where perhaps those fossil fuels are refineries and places like that. So I think there's definitely, at least these two lines of narrative, one about green space being non-essential and the second one about, the fossil fuel and dominance of gas cars being a normal part of our daily lives.
Indeed. And Ben, where do you see the role of misinformation or maybe even lack of information?
Yeah, so again, we work with a lot of utilities on how to make their existing energy efficiency programs more equitable for their communities. And the number one barrier that they report having to better uptake in energy efficiency and clean energy and electric vehicles in historically underserved communities is a lack of education and a lack of awareness and a lack of clear information for these customers. Those kinds of strategies that utilities are now showing up at more community events and working with schools and churches and local governments, making themselves known and getting better, clearer information out to these customers. That's been a critical element of their progress towards trying to advance a more equitable energy future across the country. So the education and outreach and really robust stakeholder engagement aspects of the work the utilities are doing is just so critical to actually making a difference here.
Indeed. I think we need a national marketing and advertising campaign as well about electric vehicles, because being in this industry for a while, I've seen this. I saw it with organic foods where there was there seemed to be a misinformation campaign that these were all just much more expensive, and people began to believe it. And so it was like hands down, wouldn't even try it. And so I'm beginning to sense or feel some of that about electric vehicles, because I've really seen the prices come down precipitously and approach parity with fossil fuel vehicles. But there's still people perpetuate that myth that they are just too expensive, so don't before people even bother to look at the sticker or ask about the price, they don't even consider it. They wipe it off their table because they think it's too expensive, or they have that misinformation that it's too expensive. And of course, from my perspective, when you add things to it, like being able to use it as a generator like that Ford F-150, that reduces the cost even more and gives even more benefit and value. So that was one of the things that really, I guess, surprised me, was the role of misinformation as a source of environmental injustice issues. Okay, we just have a couple of minutes to go before we go to break again, but I want to go back to Alessandro. In your research on outdoor or nature environment in green space, what have been some of the unexpected or surprising findings that you've come across there?
I think one of the very, unexpected findings is that green space is actually associated with more earnings later in life and lower healthcare spending, even when we control for class and race. in America, some of the stronger predictors of how much you're going to make or your health or how much you're going to spend for your health care are unfortunately linked to what's your race and what's your social class. And yet, studies that I did and studies that some of my colleagues did found that even when we control for these two very powerful demographic factors, having access to nature still has a measurable impact on how much you make in life and has a measurable impact on how much you spend on your annual health care bill.
Are there stats, Alessandro, on, say, earning? Let's say if you live near or within a certain mileage from green space, then you'll earn 25% more, 35% more, anything like that?
Yeah, so the effect is not at large, but we studied children growing up in poverty in the 1980s, and we measured degree of greenness, which includes not just parks, but also trees, private backyards, and all of that. And we found that children that grew up on the sort of lowest end of this green space spectrum over their career earn approximately $30,000 less than those that live in a more green neighborhoods, and that translates to approximately $700 a year.
And that's enough to buy something. We're going to go to break right now, but we will be back on the other side with Dr. Alessandro Rigolon with the University of Utah and Ben Nathan with eSource. Thank you all. We'll be right back. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. Our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, none mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lynndentalcare.com. Our other sponsor is the Weston A. Price Foundation. Based on the research of nutrition pioneer Dr. Weston Price, whose studies established the parameters of human health and determined the optimum characteristics of human diets. The Weston A. Price Foundation is a member-supported organization that's dedicated to restoring nutrient-dense food to the modern diet, especially animal fats, through education, scientific research, and activism. It connects local farms with health-conscious consumers. Their annual conference for 2022, called Wise Traditions, is coming up, where nearly 1,100 attendees gather for learning, demonstrations, exhibits, impressive speakers, and delicious, nutritious meals that embody the principles of the Weston A. Price Foundation. It's coming up in Knoxville, Tennessee on October 21st through 23rd. For more information, visit wisetraditions.org. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. To today's show on the economics of environmental justice or injustice and impacts on everyone's pocketbook. And we are back with Alessandro Rigolon with the University of Utah and with Ben Nathan with eSource. And they really are making us smarter about all of this. Now, before the break, Alessandro was talking to us about unexpected findings in his work with the environmental injustices or justice issues involved with outdoor nature space. And I like that term you used, was it green gentrification? So what I want to ask you about that, though, is how has the COVID pandemic exacerbated environmental justice issues and or shed light on others?
Yeah, so I can talk about the green space piece briefly. one way is that it did raise awareness about green space inequities. You open newspapers or other, publications, you've seen more coverage of those issues because people were told to stay home and to just be in their neighborhood. And we're told, it's okay to go to your neighborhood and just walk around. Just go to your neighborhood parks, be far from people. While the problem is that white affluent communities have those spaces and they're relatively uncrowded and they're clean and relatively free of crime. Unfortunately, low-income communities and communities of color, when they were told to go to those green spaces, they were either not finding them or finding them pretty small and crowded and maintained with, violence issues and oftentimes maybe next to a very busy highway with air pollution. And so that was one way in which, the experiences of people led the press and, to some extent policymakers to notice those inequities. And another way was that simply people of color, low-income people were more often essential workers, and therefore they didn't have the time to even go and explore those neighborhood green spaces. And white, more affluent people could work from home. And so, that contributed to, furthering inequities in the rates of uses of local green spaces. If one population, needs to keep working and another population needs to stay, can stay home and just take breaks and go for a walk once in a while.
And Ben, I want to ask you, why should, or in my opinion, why must, those who are not affected by environmental justice or environmental injustice issues, why must they care?
Well, our energy system is truly the physical manifestation of connecting us all. We are all connected through this physical network of power plants, of transmission and distribution lines, of natural gas pipelines that power all of our lives, our homes, our businesses, that really power everything we do. So we are all part of this system together. We all pay our utility bills to keep these large, complex systems up and running, and that requires us all to be able to afford and reliably pay our bills to support this system. A power outage in one part of a community can easily spread to neighboring communities. And along the same lines, as I mentioned earlier, pollution doesn't respect boundaries. Everyone will suffer from pollution and climate change, and although the impact can be disproportionate in certain areas, like near a coastline or near a polluting power plant, we are all bearing impacts from what happens in our neighbors communities. So we need to make targeted investments to make sure that everyone is able to afford their energy and stay above water and reduce pollution, because these things we're seeing are really affecting us system-wide. And I think COVID exposed that a lot as well.
Very much so. I think both of you all today have mentioned essential workers, and that's what COVID really shed a really bright light on the necessity of essential workers and the impact that they have in our society. We're still seeing it and feeling it, and it looks like we might still be seeing it and feeling it for a while. But the essential workers are more often than not part of these vulnerable classes. And when they can't get to work, we all suffer. Alessandro, let me ask you, what cost is climate change adding to everyone's economic burden of environmental justice or environmental injustice?
I can think about two, at least, main sources. One is heat, and the second is increasing floods. So neighborhoods that don't have enough green spaces generally are also neighborhoods with a lot of surface parking, with large highways and streets that trap the heat as opposed to cooling off, the cooling inside of green space. And so with increasingly hot summers, and not just summers, unfortunately springs and falls, we are, especially those low-income communities of color, have disproportionate impacts from heat. As the silent killer, as they call it, is that heat waves are the events that leads to most deaths, more than tornadoes, more than floods, more than any other severe weather events, and we are all paying that cost through increased ER visits, et cetera. And I want to link to what Ben was talking about in terms of having issues related to people not being able to be cool in their homes because they might not be able to afford those bills. And the second, is floods. We've seen almost weekly the severe weather events in Tennessee, in central Illinois a couple of weeks ago. Globally, a third of population in Pakistan is now affected by the largest flood in a generation. And so having places that don't have green space and permeable surfaces that filter the waters, and instead having a lot of surface parking lots, big box commercial buildings, and big highways and big streets that contributes to worsening floods, whereas nature-based solutions like parks, greenways, bioswales would help us not only address environmental injustices, but also reduce the flooding impacts of severe weather and climate change, especially on marginalized communities.
But it's interesting you said, because those big box stores and those big facilities and all of that are really the marginalized communities. They're causing issues, but the marginalized communities don't really benefit from them that much. But yet they bear the burden, or they pay for their existence, which I think is something that happens from what I tell all around the world, like Pakistan. I was just riding around one day, and I was hearing about the floods in Pakistan, but they were talking about the fact how basically caused very little or had very little impact on global warming, yet they were having this disproportionate burden of it.
Yes, both globally and nationally, the people most affected by climate change are the ones who cause it the least. Basically, the top 10% globally of the population that has the most wealth causes more than about 90% of emissions. That's why the idea of climate justice seeks to, think about transitions to more, climate adapt and mitigate climate change in a way that, especially to limit the impact on those most marginalized populations, again, both nationally and globally. We have, the United States is a, big emitter, and we have a relatively small population, comparatively to, China or India.
Ben, last word. What can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions to some of these injustices with energy, which is your area, but also in other aspects of environmental justice or environmental injustice?
Yeah, believe it or not, it doesn't always seem like this, but your state and your local government, your power utilities, even our federal government are all accountable to all of us. And they are increasingly focusing on environmental justice and issues like energy equity, and they want to hear from us. They want to hear from representatives of every community, especially historically underserved communities. They want to hear from community-based organizations, from community and customer advocates, and they want to factor our input into their plans and programs. We are seeing this increasingly in the energy utility industry. So get involved, read up, learn more. There's lots of great organizations out there working on this, and you can actually voice what you need and what your community needs, and people will listen.
Thank you. We really appreciate both of you all helping us unpack this a lot more today and bringing a lot more understanding to it. We have been with Dr. Alessandro Rigolon with the University of Utah and with Ben Nathan with eSource. Thank you all. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is the result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day, like yourselves. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up one way or the other to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you for listening in today, and join us again next week for more on environmental justice, the economics of it all. Thank you.